In the autumn of 1872, somewhere in the wild territories between Kansas and Colorado, 6 words spoken by a starving child would shatter the walls around a bitter man's heart and prove that, even in the cruelest wilderness, compassion could survive if given the smallest chance to breathe. This was not a story told in grand courtrooms or written in leather-bound history books, but rather a tale whispered around campfires and passed down through generations of frontier families who understood that the greatest battles of the Wild West were not always fought with guns and violence, but sometimes with courage and mercy, and the desperate honesty of a child who had nothing left to lose except hope itself. On that fateful day, when a lonely rancher encountered a boy protecting a meager scrap of food, the course of 2 lives changed forever, reminding everyone who heard the story that redemption can arrive in the most unexpected moments, and that no heart is ever truly beyond the reach of human kindness. The American frontier was never a gentle place for dreamers or the weak of spirit. It demanded everything from those who dared to cross its endless plains and climb its towering mountains, offering in return only the harsh promise that survival was possible for those strong enough and stubborn enough to endure. Families traveled west with hope burning bright in their hearts, believing that hard work and determination could transform barren land into prosperous farms, that freedom and opportunity waited just beyond the next river or mountain range. But the reality they found was far different from the dreams that had carried them across half a continent. The soil was often poor and rocky, the water was scarce and unreliable, the winters were brutal beyond imagination, and the summers could bake the earth until it cracked open like broken pottery. In this unforgiving landscape, people learned to guard what little they had with fierce determination, and trust became a luxury that few could afford. Yet even here, in this place where hardness seemed like the only logical response to constant hardship, there were moments when the human capacity for goodness shone through the darkness like stars breaking through storm clouds. His name was Ezra Blackwood, though most people in the scattered settlements simply called him Black Ezra, or sometimes just the Shadow, because he moved through the world like a dark ghost who wanted nothing to do with the living. Ezra had built his ranch in the high country where the grasslands met the foothills, a remote location that suited his desire to be left completely alone. His property sprawled across several thousand acres of rough terrain that he had claimed and defended with the same cold determination that marked everything he did. The ranch buildings were solid and well built, constructed with his own hands over the course of many years, each plank and stone representing another day of solitary labor, another night of sleeping under stars that felt more like ice than light. Nobody knew the full truth of why Ezra Blackwood had become the hard and bitter man he was, though speculation ran wild among the settlers and ranchers who occasionally crossed paths with him. Some whispered that he had been a soldier during the Great War between the states, that he had seen brothers and friends cut down in battles so bloody that his soul had simply stopped feeling anything at all. Others claimed he had lost a sweetheart to another man, that betrayal had turned his heart to stone and made him incapable of trusting anyone ever again. A few believed he had always been this way, born under a dark star with something broken inside him that could never be fixed. Whatever the truth of his past, the reality of his present was impossible to ignore. Ezra Blackwood wanted nothing from anyone and gave nothing in return, living his isolated existence with a determination that bordered on obsession. The few times Ezra came into the nearest town to purchase supplies or conduct necessary business, people gave him a wide berth and spoke to him only when absolutely required. He never smiled, never made small talk, never showed the slightest interest in the lives of others or the community events that helped isolated settlers maintain their connection to civilization. Shopkeepers learned to simply fill his orders without attempting conversation. The blacksmith worked in silence when Ezra brought horses to be shod. Even the saloon keeper, a friendly man who prided himself on getting everyone to talk eventually, had given up trying to engage Ezra in anything beyond the bare minimum exchange of words needed to conduct business. Black Ezra had made it perfectly clear through years of consistent coldness that he wanted to be left alone, and people had learned to respect that wish even as they whispered about him, and wondered what had created such a frozen and unreachable human being. Down in the valley below Ezra's high ranch, along a creek that sometimes ran strong and sometimes dried to mud, there stood a tiny homestead that seemed to lean into the wind as if too tired to stand up straight. This was where the Fletcher family struggled to survive on dreams that had long since turned to dust. Robert Fletcher had brought his wife Mary and their 3 young children west 2 years earlier, following promises of free land and opportunity that had proven to be half-truths at best. The reality they found was a small plot of difficult ground, a harsh climate that destroyed more crops than it nurtured, and an isolation that pressed down on them like a physical weight. Their cabin was barely large enough to shelter all 5 of them, with walls made of rough logs and a roof that leaked during every rain. They owned 2 skinny cows, a handful of chickens that rarely laid eggs, and one aging horse that looked as tired and beaten down as the family itself. Mary Fletcher worked miracles with almost nothing, somehow keeping her children fed and clothed despite resources so meager that most people would have considered the situation hopeless. She baked bread from flour they could barely afford. She mended clothes until the patches covered more area than the original fabric. She sang songs to her children at night to help them forget the hunger that gnawed at their bellies, and she maintained a faith in better days that seemed to defy all evidence to the contrary. Robert worked himself nearly to death trying to coax crops from soil that seemed determined to defeat him, hauling water from the creek when the rains did not come, repairing buildings that fell apart faster than he could fix them, and fighting a losing battle against the harsh reality that some land was simply not meant to support a family, no matter how hard they worked. The 3 Fletcher children were named Benjamin, Sarah, and little Emma. Benjamin was the oldest at 9 years, already helping his father with heavy labor that should have been beyond his strength, his thin arms and bony shoulders bearing burdens that no child should have to carry. Sarah was 7, a quiet girl who helped her mother with endless chores and watched over her baby sister with a seriousness that made her seem far older than her years. And Emma was only 4, still young enough to find joy in simple things like pretty rocks and bird songs, though even she was beginning to understand that their family was struggling in ways that went beyond normal hardship. These children knew hunger as a constant companion, knew cold that penetrated deep into their bones during winter, knew that their parents worried constantly, even when they tried to hide it behind forced smiles and reassuring words. The autumn of 1872 arrived early and harsh, bringing frost that killed what few crops the Fletchers had managed to grow and temperatures that promised a brutal winter ahead. Robert stood in his withered field one morning in late September and felt something inside him come close to breaking. 2 years of backbreaking labor had produced almost nothing. Their supplies were dangerously low, their animals were weak and unlikely to survive a hard winter, and they had no money to purchase what they needed even if credit had been available, which it was not. Mary tried to maintain hope, but Robert could see the fear growing in her eyes every time she looked at their children, could hear the desperation in her voice when she prayed at night for deliverance that never seemed to come. Robert made the difficult decision to leave his family for a few weeks to seek work at larger ranches in the territory, hoping to earn enough money or trade goods to see them through the winter. Mary did not want him to go, terrified of being left alone with 3 small children in such a vulnerable situation, but she also understood they had run out of options. They spent their last few coins on flour and beans, barely enough to last until Robert returned, and he rode away on their tired horse with his head bowed, and his heart heavy with the knowledge that he was gambling his family's survival on the slim chance that someone would hire a desperate man for temporary work. The day after Robert left, young Benjamin Fletcher made a decision that would change everything. He had been listening to his parents' whispered conversations for weeks, understanding far more than they realized about how desperate their situation had become. He knew his mother was skipping meals to feed her children, knew his father had been going without food entirely some days, knew that little Emma had been coughing in a way that frightened everyone even though no one spoke about it directly. Benjamin understood that his family was in real danger, and even though he was only 9 years old, he decided he needed to do something to help them survive. Benjamin had watched his father hunt small game around their homestead, had learned the basics of setting snares for rabbits and tracking animals through the brush. He was not skilled or experienced, but he knew enough to try, and desperation gave him courage that wisdom might have denied. On a cool morning when mist still clung to the valley like ghostly sheets, Benjamin told his mother he was going to check the trapline near the creek. Then he took his father's old rifle, the single bullet they had left for emergencies, and walked quietly away from the cabin before anyone could question his intentions or realize what he planned to attempt. The boy walked for over an hour, moving slowly and carefully, trying to remember everything he had seen his father do when hunting. He looked for tracks in the soft earth near water sources, watched for signs of animals feeding, moved as quietly as his small feet could manage through brush and grass. His heart pounded with fear and determination mixed together, knowing that his family was counting on him even though they did not know what he was trying to accomplish. Benjamin had never shot anything larger than a tin can for practice, had never been this far from home alone, but he pushed forward because turning back meant accepting failure, and he was not ready to do that. When Benjamin finally saw the rabbit sitting near a berry bush, his breath caught in his throat. It was not large, but it was big enough to provide meat for at least 2 meals if his mother cooked it carefully. The animal sat perhaps 30 feet away, nibbling at grass, completely unaware that a desperate child was watching with a rifle that felt impossibly heavy in his small hands. Benjamin's father had taught him to breathe slowly, to squeeze the trigger gently rather than jerking it, to aim carefully because wasting bullets was something poor families could not afford. The boy raised the rifle, feeling it wobble as his arms trembled with effort and nervousness, trying desperately to hold it steady enough to hit his target. The rifle's explosion shattered the peaceful morning. The recoil knocked Benjamin backward onto the ground, leaving him dazed and disoriented for several seconds. When he scrambled to his feet and ran toward where the rabbit had been, he found it lying still, killed cleanly by a shot that had been equal parts skill and luck. Benjamin wanted to shout with joy, wanted to cry with relief, wanted to run home immediately to show his mother that he had brought food. But then he heard something that turned his triumph into terror, the sound of a horse approaching, and when he looked up, he saw a rider coming over the ridge, silhouetted black against the morning sky. Ezra Blackwood had been riding his property boundary when he heard the rifle shot echo across the hills. Gunfire near his land always meant potential trouble that needed investigating, whether from poachers or trespassers or something worse. He rode toward the sound with his hand on his own rifle, expecting to find someone who would need to be warned away or driven off his territory. What he found instead stopped him cold. A skinny child standing over a dead rabbit, looking up at him with eyes that showed pure terror mixed with desperate defiance. Ezra reined in his horse and stared down at the boy, his weathered face showing no expression whatsoever, taking in the threadbare clothes and the too large rifle, and the rabbit that represented either incredible luck or impossible skill for someone so young and small. Benjamin stood frozen, every frightening story he had ever heard about Black Ezra flooding through his mind all at once. People said this man had no mercy, that he had driven off families who accidentally crossed his land, that he cared about nothing and no one except his own isolated existence. Benjamin's first instinct was to run, to leave the rabbit and flee back to his family's cabin as fast as his legs could carry him. But then he looked down at the rabbit, thought about his mother and sisters going hungry, remembered his father's desperation when he left to seek work, and something inside the boy hardened into determination. He would not run. He would not abandon the food his family needed. If Black Ezra wanted to take the rabbit or punish him for being near his land, then Benjamin would face whatever came, but he would not give up without trying to protect what was his. Ezra dismounted slowly, his boots hitting the ground with a thud that seemed to echo in the tense silence. He walked over to where the rabbit lay and examined it with the practiced eye of someone who had hunted for decades. He noted the clean shot, the fact that the animal had not suffered, and he felt a grudging respect for whoever had made that shot, even if it had probably been more luck than skill. Then he looked at the boy standing there with fists clenched and chin raised in defiant terror, and Ezra made a decision that followed the pattern of his entire isolated existence. He would take the rabbit. It was near his land, perhaps even on his land, and the boy was clearly too poor and weak to stop him. That was how the world worked. The strong took what they wanted, and the weak learned to accept their losses. "I'll take this rabbit," Ezra said, his voice cold and flat as winter ice. "You're on or near my property, and that means anything taken here belongs to me. Run along home, boy, before I decide to take that rifle too." He bent down to pick up the rabbit, fully expecting the child to turn and flee as most people did when confronted by his harsh presence. But Benjamin Fletcher did not run. Instead, he did something that Ezra would never forget for the rest of his life. The boy stepped forward, putting himself between Ezra and the rabbit, and spoke words that came straight from his heart without any thought for safety or strategy or what might happen next. "Please don't take our food," Benjamin said, his voice shaking but clear, his eyes meeting Ezra's without looking away despite the fear that made his whole body tremble. "We saved all day for this. My ma and my sisters are hungry. My pa is gone looking for work because we're failing. This rabbit is all we have. Please, mister, please don't take it from us. We saved all day for this." The words hung in the air between them, simple and honest and impossible to ignore. Ezra stood perfectly still, staring at the boy who had dared to stand up to him, and something happened inside the rancher that he did not understand and did not want to acknowledge. For years he had successfully pushed away every attempt at human connection, had turned cold and hard and alone, because alone meant safe, and safe meant never being hurt again. But this child's desperate plea had found a crack in the armor Ezra had built around his heart, reaching something he thought had died completely long ago. Ezra heard Benjamin's confused sentence about saving all day for the food, and even though the grammar was fractured by youth and emotion, he understood perfectly what the boy meant. This family had been saving everything they had, saving their strength and their hope and their last reserves of faith, waiting desperately for something good to happen, and this rabbit represented that good thing they had been praying for. And Ezra was about to take it away from them simply because he could, simply because that was what the man he had become would do, the man who cared about nothing except his own bitter existence. For the first time in years, Ezra Blackwood felt something that might have been shame. He looked at this brave child protecting a dead rabbit like it was the most precious treasure in the world, and he suddenly saw himself through different eyes. He saw a grown man about to steal food from a starving family, saw someone who had become so twisted by his own pain that he was ready to inflict suffering on people who had done nothing to deserve it. The realization hit him like a physical blow, and for several long seconds Ezra could not move or speak, frozen by the unexpected recognition of how far he had fallen from the person he had once been. Ezra stepped back from the rabbit and turned away from Benjamin, unable to meet those desperate, hopeful eyes any longer. His hands were shaking slightly, something that never happened no matter what task he performed, and he felt a tightness in his chest that he had not experienced in over a decade. Every instinct told him to mount his horse and ride away, to retreat back to his ranch and his isolation, and forget this encounter had ever happened. That would be the safe choice, the choice that protected him from feeling anything that might hurt. But another voice, quieter but more insistent, whispered that maybe safety was not worth the price he had been paying for it, that maybe living without feeling was just another way of being dead. "Keep your rabbit, boy," Ezra said finally, his voice even rougher than usual, barely more than a gravelly whisper. "Get on home and feed your family." He walked toward his horse, moving like a man who had suddenly become very old and very tired. But before he could mount and ride away, Benjamin called out to him, the boy's voice carrying a mixture of gratitude and confusion that made Ezra pause despite himself. "Thank you, mister," Benjamin said, clutching the rabbit against his chest like he feared it might disappear if he loosened his grip. "Thank you for not taking our food. I was so scared you would take it, but you didn't. And my ma is gonna be so happy, and my sisters can eat tonight. And I promise I wasn't trying to steal from you or trespass or anything bad. I was just trying to help my family. Thank you." Ezra stood with his back to the boy, one hand on his saddle, fighting an internal battle that no one else could see. The smart thing would be to ride away now, to end this encounter before it led anywhere he did not want to go. But he found himself turning around instead, found himself looking at Benjamin Fletcher, and seeing not just this one desperate child, but every person he had turned away over the years, every plea for help he had ignored, every opportunity for human connection he had deliberately destroyed. And he made a decision that terrified him more than any physical danger ever could. He chose to care, just this once, to see what happened when he allowed his frozen heart to thaw even slightly. "Where's your homestead?" Ezra asked, the words emerging from his mouth before he had fully decided to speak them. Benjamin pointed toward the valley, explaining quickly where their cabin stood and how to find it. Ezra nodded slowly, then pulled a cloth bag from his saddlebag and handed it to the boy. "There's bread and dried meat in there," Ezra said gruffly. "Should help until your father gets back. And you tell your mother that if she needs anything, anything at all to keep your family going through winter, she can send word to Ezra Blackwood up at the ranch on the ridge. I won't promise miracles, but I'll do what I can." Benjamin stared at the bag in his hands, hardly able to believe what was happening. Black Ezra, the man everyone feared and avoided, was giving them food and offering to help them survive. It seemed impossible, like a dream that might evaporate if the boy said the wrong thing or moved too quickly. But the bag was solid and real in his hands, and the gruff rancher standing before him was actually waiting for an answer. So Benjamin nodded and promised he would deliver the message to his mother. Ezra mounted his horse and rode away without another word, but something fundamental had changed inside him during that brief encounter. The walls he had built around his heart had cracked, and through those cracks, light was beginning to seep in after years of darkness. He rode back to his ranch thinking about the desperate boy and his starving family, thinking about how close he had come to stealing from people who had nothing, thinking about the man he had become and wondering if it was too late to become someone different. Benjamin ran home faster than he had ever run in his life, the rabbit bouncing against his chest and the bag of food clutched tight in his other hand. When he burst into the cabin shouting about what had happened, Mary Fletcher could hardly believe the story her son told. Black Ezra had let him keep the rabbit. The ghost of the high country had given them food and offered to help. It seemed like a fairy tale rather than reality. But the evidence was there in Benjamin's hands, and that night the Fletcher family ate rabbit stew with fresh bread, their bellies full for the first time in weeks, their hearts beginning to hope that maybe, just maybe, they might survive the coming winter after all. Over the following weeks, Ezra Blackwood found himself doing things that would have been unthinkable just a short time before. He rode down to the Fletcher homestead with supplies he claimed he no longer needed, delivering flour and beans and salt with gruff explanations that his storage was too full, and the goods would spoil if someone did not use them. He showed up one afternoon and spent hours helping Benjamin and his mother repair their leaking roof, working in silence but working nonetheless. When Robert Fletcher finally returned from his unsuccessful job search to find their situation improved, Ezra was there, and the two men reached an understanding that required few words but meant everything. Robert would work on Ezra's ranch for fair wages, and in return, Ezra would teach him skills that might help the Fletcher family succeed on their difficult land. The transformation in Ezra Blackwood was not sudden or dramatic, but it was real and it was lasting. The frozen man who had wanted nothing to do with anyone slowly began to thaw, allowing himself to care about the Fletcher family, allowing himself to feel the satisfaction that came from helping rather than hurting, allowing himself to remember that life had meaning beyond simple survival. He never became warm or openly friendly, never lost his gruff exterior or his preference for solitude, but he was no longer the bitter ghost who pushed away every human connection. Benjamin's desperate plea had reached something inside him that he thought was dead, had reminded him that no matter how much pain life had dealt him, choosing to inflict pain on others only created more suffering in a world that already had more than enough. The Fletcher family not only survived that winter, but began to thrive in the years that followed, helped by Ezra's steady employment of Robert and his teaching of skills that made all the difference between failure and success. Benjamin grew up strong and capable, never forgetting the man who had chosen mercy over cruelty on that autumn morning. He eventually inherited Ezra's ranch when the old rancher died peacefully many years later, having lived long enough to see the boy he had almost stolen from become a good man and successful rancher in his own right. The story of Ezra Blackwood and Benjamin Fletcher became one of those tales that frontier families told around their fires at night, passing it down through generations as a reminder that redemption is always possible if we have the courage to reach for it. 6 simple words spoken by a desperate child had accomplished what years of isolation could not destroy. They had proven that beneath even the hardest exterior, the human heart can still respond to honest need and genuine vulnerability. Benjamin's plea had not been strategic or manipulative, had not appealed to complex arguments or tried to make Ezra feel guilty. It had simply been the truth spoken from the heart of a boy who loved his family and could not bear to watch them suffer, and that authentic desperation had reached through walls that nothing else could penetrate. The Wild West was harsh and unforgiving, a place that tested every person who dared to call it home, demanding strength and resilience, and sometimes a hardness that could easily become cruelty if not balanced by compassion. But the story of the lonely rancher and the desperate boy reminds us that even in the harshest environments, kindness can survive and even flourish if we give it the opportunity. Ezra Blackwood had spent years building his isolated existence, convinced that emotional walls would protect him from pain, only to discover that those same walls had cut him off from everything that makes life worth living. Connection, purpose, the satisfaction of helping others, the profound meaning that comes from being part of something larger than ourselves. Today, more than a century after that autumn morning when a child's plea melted a frozen heart, the lesson remains as relevant as ever. We all build walls to protect ourselves from hurt. All retreat into isolation when the world becomes too painful. All risk becoming hard and bitter when life deals us losses we believe we cannot survive. But the story of Ezra and Benjamin teaches us that no matter how thick our walls or how deep our pain, we are never truly beyond the reach of human connection, never so damaged that we cannot heal, never so lost that we cannot find our way back to compassion and kindness. Sometimes all it takes is one honest plea, one moment of choosing to care instead of choosing safety, one crack in the armor that lets the light back in. And in that moment, everything can change, not just for the person receiving help, but for the person giving it, proving once again that in helping others we often save ourselves, and that the greatest treasures of the human experience are not found in isolation, but in the connections we forge with each other along the difficult journey we all share.